Smokey Yunick once showed up to a NASCAR tech inspection, got his car disqualified, then removed the gas tank, drove the car out of the garage anyway, and yelled back that NASCAR could keep the tank. The car ran for 2 more miles before it died. That's the kind of guy we're talking about. And in 1963, he built something so fast, so unfair, that Chevrolet pretended it didn't exist. This is the story of the 427 Mystery Motor, the engine that was too good for its own good. Keep watching and find out how one genius mechanic and a group of rogue engineers created the most dominant engine NASCAR never wanted you to see. Let's rewind to 1962. NASCAR was king. 500,000 people showed up to Daytona that year. The stands were packed, the money was flowing, and Detroit was locked in a brutal horsepower war. Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet were spending millions trying to beat each other on Sunday so they could sell cars on Monday. Win on the track, win at the dealership. Simple formula. Except nothing about this era was simple. Ford had just dropped the 427 SOHC, the Cammer, single overhead cam, hemispherical combustion chambers, and enough power to make grown men weep. Chrysler had the Hemi, obviously. Max Wedge motors were putting out 400-plus horsepower right off the showroom floor. The arms race was on. But Chevy had a problem. They were showing up to gunfights with knives. The small block 327 was a beautiful engine. Reliable, efficient, brilliant engineering for the street. But on the high banks of Daytona, against Ford's big block Fury, it was like bringing a calculator to a demolition derby. Chevy needed something big, something mean, something nobody saw coming. Enter Smokey Yunick. Born Henry Yunick in 1923, Smokey was a World War II bomber pilot who came home and decided fixing cars was more fun than fixing people. He opened a garage in Daytona Beach called the best damn garage in town. That wasn't marketing. That was a promise. And he delivered. Smokey wasn't your typical wrench turner. He held patents on everything from intake manifolds to turbocharger systems. He designed his own tools. He didn't just think outside the box. He melted the box down and used the metal for something faster. NASCAR officials hated him. Engineers worshipped him. Drivers trusted him with their lives. Literally. By 1963, Smokey was already a legend. He'd won Daytona in 1961. He'd been thrown out of tech inspection more times than most crews had been through it. And when Chevrolet came knocking with a problem, Smokey didn't just want to solve it. He wanted to embarrass everyone who doubted him. Now here's where things get interesting. Officially, Chevrolet wasn't involved in racing. In January 1963, the Automobile Manufacturers Association reaffirmed the racing ban they'd put in place back in 1957. Every major automaker signed it. No factory support, no factory money, no factory engines showing up at the track with thin alibis. It was supposed to be a gentleman's agreement. Emphasis on supposed to be, because while Chevrolet executives were publicly shaking hands and nodding about responsible corporate behavior, a small group of engineers in the back rooms were building a monster. They called it the Mystery Motor, not because it was mysterious in function, but because nobody outside a select few even knew it existed. The project was so secretive that most Chevrolet employees didn't know about it. Parts were machined at different facilities. Engineers worked in isolated groups. The engine was never called by its real name in memos. It was always code words, always vague references. But they were doing it quietly. Very quietly. Start with the displacement. 427 cubic inches. Same as Ford's newest big block. But that's where the similarities ended. Chevy's engineers took everything they'd learned from the small block 283 and 327 and scaled it up. Lightweight thin wall castings. High-flow cylinder heads. Forged steel crank. Forged connecting rods. This wasn't some parts bin special. This was purpose-built Fury. The head design was the secret sauce. Massive ports. Huge valves. The intake runners flowed like nobody's business. Compression ratios that would make an emissions engineer faint. We're talking 12.5 to 1 in some configurations. You couldn't run pump gas in this thing if you tried. It needed 103-octane racing fuel, just to wake up without knocking itself to death. And the power. That's conservative. Some dyno sheets showed over 500 in 1963. For context, A Corvette Stingray that year came with 360 horsepower, and people thought that was witchcraft. The mystery motor was making 140 more horses than Chevy's hottest production engine. It wasn't an upgrade, it was a different species. Smokey got his hands on 2 of these engines in late 1962. Maybe 3. The exact number is still debated because Chevrolet's record-keeping on the project was intentionally terrible. What we do know is that Smokey looked at this mill and saw potential everyone else missed. The engine was fast, but Smokey could make it faster. He started with the intake system. The factory setup was good. Smokey's was better. He designed a custom intake manifold that improved flow by another 10%. Then he went to work on the exhaust. Heaters that looked like musical instruments. All swooping curves and calculated lengths. This wasn't shade tree fabrication. This was engineering that would have made aerospace guys jealous. Smokey tested everything. Spark plug heat ranges. Ignition timing curves. Carburetor jetting. He'd run a configuration, tear it down, measure the wear patterns, and adjust. Then he'd do it again and again. That mystery motor wasn't just fast, it was reliable. Reliable speed beats unreliable speed every single time. The car he dropped it into was a 1963 Chevrolet Impala. Not some lightweight special. A full-size sedan that weighed over 3,500 pounds. The thing was a boat. But Smokey didn't care about weight. He had power. Lots of power. Enough power that weight was just a math problem. And math problems could be solved with torque. Smokey's Impala showed up at Daytona in February 1963 for Speed Weeks. This is where things get spicy. The car was fast in practice. Not just fast, stupid fast. Junior Johnson put it on the pole for one of the qualifying races with a speed that made everyone stop and stare. We're talking speeds that the Ford and Chrysler teams couldn't touch. They had big blocks. They had factory support. And some guy from Daytona Beach with an engine nobody had seen before was embarrassing them. The other teams immediately smelled something fishy. What engine is that? Where'd it come from? Can we see the block casting numbers? Smokey, being Smokey, was about as helpful as a screen door on a submarine. He'd shrug, smile, and say something vague about special parts. NASCAR officials poked around but couldn't find anything technically illegal. The engine met the displacement rules. It fit in the chassis. It wasn't turbocharged or fuel injected. On paper it was legal, but boy did people complain. Ford's team manager practically had a heart attack. Chrysler threatened to pull out of the race. This wasn't competition anymore. This was a mugging. Junior Johnson drove that Impala like it was rocket-powered. He'd pull away from the pack on the straights like they were standing still. The only thing that kept him from completely dominating was that the car was heavy in the corners. But who needs cornering when you've got 50 more horsepower than everyone else? Junior didn't win the 500 that year. The car broke, because of course it did. This is racing. But the damage was done. Everyone knew Chevy had something special. Ford and Chrysler went back to Detroit and started making phone calls. Angry phone calls. The kind of phone calls that involve lawyers and threats to leave NASCAR entirely if something wasn't done about Chevrolet's cheating. Except it wasn't cheating. That was the beautiful part. They just followed them in a way that made everyone else look foolish. The rules said 427 cubic inches maximum. The rules said production-based engines only. Well, technically the mystery motor was production-based. Sort of. If you squinted and ignored the fact that exactly 0 of these engines had been installed in production cars. That's where NASCAR drew the line. In April 1963, NASCAR updated the rules. Any engine used in competition had to be available to the general public in production vehicles. Not in limited quantities. Not as a special order. Actually available. You had to be able to walk into a dealership and buy a car with that engine. Ford could do that. Chrysler could do that. Chevrolet could not do that. The mystery motor was banned before it ever got to prove what it could really do. Chevrolet didn't even fight it. Remember, they weren't supposed to be racing anyway. Defending the mystery motor meant admitting they'd been running a covert racing program, while publicly claiming they weren't involved in racing. The PR nightmare alone wasn't worth it. So they did what big corporations do when caught doing something embarrassing. They pretended it never happened. The mystery motor disappeared. Engines were recalled. Parts were destroyed. Documentation was conveniently lost. Chevy went back to racing the 327 and acted like nothing had occurred. But the genie was out of the bottle. Everyone in NASCAR knew what Chevy had built. More importantly, everyone knew what Chevy was capable of when they stopped playing nice. Smokey kept his engines. One of them, anyway. Maybe two. He'd quietly slide that 427 into cars for testing, for match races, for situations where NASCAR wasn't watching too closely. The thing was too good to just throw away. And Smokey wasn't the type to throw away anything useful. The legacy of the mystery motor didn't die in 1963. It evolved. Because here's the thing about good ideas. They don't disappear. They mutate. 3 years later, in 1966, Chevrolet released the Mark II 427 Big Block. Officially, this was a completely different engine. Different everything. Except the engineers who worked on it were the same ones who'd worked on the mystery motor. And if you looked closely at the design, you could see the family resemblance. The port designs. The valve arrangements. The thinking that went into making big power reliable. The Mark II 427 became the foundation for Chevy's big block dynasty. The 427, the 454, the motors that powered Corvettes and Chevelles and Camaros for decades. Every single one of them owed something to that banned engine from 1963. The mystery motor was the prototype. Everything that came after was refinement. And Smokey kept building fast cars and driving NASCAR officials insane. He once showed up with a car that was 7/8 scale. Everything was smaller. The car met minimum weight requirements because he'd built it with thicker metal. But it was more aerodynamic because it was smaller. NASCAR didn't catch it for weeks. When they did, they rewrote the rulebook. Again, he built a Chevelle with a fuel tank that held 22 gallons. Except the tank actually held closer to 40 gallons because Smokey had run fuel lines the size of garden hoses that held an extra 18 gallons. Technically, the fuel lines weren't part of the tank, therefore, not illegal. NASCAR measured his fuel lines after that race. Smokey thought it was hilarious. The best story though, the one that defined Smokey's whole approach to racing, happened at another tech inspection. NASCAR officials told him his car was illegal and wouldn't be allowed to race. Smokey argued. They didn't budge. So Smokey disconnected the fuel tank, left it sitting on the ground, climbed into the car, fired it up, and drove out of the garage. The car made it 2 miles down the road before it finally ran out of gas. Those garden hose fuel lines were still full. Speechless. What do you even say to that? That's the spirit of the mystery motor era. A time when guys like Smokey Yunick could take a rulebook, read it 50 times, find the one loophole nobody thought of, and exploit it so brilliantly that the entire racing world had to stop and rewrite the rules. It wasn't cheating. It was art. The 427 mystery motor proved something Detroit already suspected, but NASCAR didn't want to admit. Factory backing wasn't just an advantage. It was everything. The teams with factory support had access to engineering resources, testing facilities, unlimited budgets. The privateers were bringing butter knives to sword fights. NASCAR wanted stock car racing to be about drivers and preparation. The mystery motor showed it was about who had the best engineers and the deepest pockets. That's why NASCAR changed the rules. Not because the engine was unsafe, not because it was unreliable, but because it exposed the inequality in the sport. If Chevy could show up with a secret engine that nobody else had access to, the whole idea of stock car racing fell apart. It wasn't stock anymore. It was prototype racing with fenders. Looking back, the mystery motor was both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph of engineering. Smokey and those Chevy engineers built an engine that was light years ahead of anything else in 1963. It was powerful, reliable, and would have dominated NASCAR if given the chance. But it was a tragedy, because it represented everything wrong with the gentleman's agreement and factory involvement. The engine existed in a gray area that shouldn't have existed at all. Today, surviving mystery motors are worth stupid money. We're talking 6 figures for an engine that barely raced. Collectors want them because they represent the ultimate what if. What if NASCAR had allowed it? What if Chevy had gone public with the program? What if Smokey had gotten a full season with that motor? We'll never know. And that mystery, that unanswered question, is part of what makes the engine legendary. The mystery motor also changed how NASCAR approached rules. The sanctioning body got a lot more specific about what was and wasn't allowed. Engine specs became detailed. Inspection procedures got stricter. The days of showing up with something wild and hoping nobody noticed were over. Smokey hated it. He thought NASCAR was killing innovation. And maybe he was right. Maybe racing got a little less interesting when everybody had to use the same stuff. But here's the thing. The spirit of that 427 never really died. It lived on in every Chevy big block that came after it. It lived on in every mechanic who looked at a rule book and thought, bet I can work around that. It lived on in Smokey's garage, where he kept building faster cars and finding new ways to make NASCAR officials regret their career choices. The mystery motor wasn't just an engine. It was a middle finger to the establishment. A reminder that sometimes the best way to win is to change the game entirely. And that's the real lesson here. Smokey Yunick didn't just build a fast engine. He built a legend. Something so good it couldn't be allowed to exist. Something so threatening to the status quo that an entire sport had to change its rules to stop it. That's not losing. That's immortality. The 427 mystery motor lost the battle but won the war. It never won a championship. It barely won a race. But 60 years later, we're still talking about it. Ford's 427? Great engine. Chrysler's Hemi? Legendary. But the mystery motor? That's mythology. If you want more stories about the engines that changed everything and the lunatics who built them, hit that subscribe button. And if you've got a favorite Smokey Yunick story, drop it in the comments. I guarantee half of you have heard something I haven't. See you next time.